but at the same time, it's a new experience for developers, certainly in the Southeast. In the Northeast, people have been developing in urban centers for quite a while. We do a nice urban development in this area, and we just walked on water. Well, it's because in the Southeast, we are just migrating from living in these 3/4 acre lots, and now having to deal with the fact that the world is changing, and the next generation, thank God, is much more conscious about quality of life choices, and they want different things. They want instant gratification, so everything has to be right there, and so it makes for the move to more densely developed areas in urban centers. And I think that's good for us. We start destroying as much of the environment when we start leveraging our infrastructure that way. So the mix of density around transit with a lot of choice and putting it close to where amenities and infrastructure already exist is really the product, the dominant product of the future. And I think Chris's slide sort of made that clear, and you can see why it's happening as opposed to having a big question mark about what's really going on.
Thank you, Egbert. Eugene?
Well, once again, I too thought it was an absolutely phenomenal presentation. It's kind of hard to disagree overall with what we just saw. I think I'll try to take a slightly opposing view to some degree on some things that we covered. Clearly, we've been through a horrible housing market here in Atlanta and throughout the country over the past 4 or 5 years, but we've reached a point right now where things are starting to recover, and recovery is taking place, first and foremost perhaps in the closer in markets, but I'm also seeing recovery occur in the areas that aren't so close into Metro Atlanta, such as North Fulton County, Forsyth County, scattered parts of Gwinnett, East Cobb. So it does make me wonder, well, are those areas included in your suburban, definition? Something else that we've been tracking here during the downturn is the active adult communities, age 55 plus. Those communities here in Atlanta have been doing the best. Now they've slowed down as well, but what's fascinating to me is to see our best-selling subdivisions in Metro Atlanta are active adult. One's 50 miles north of Atlanta, and the other one's 50 miles south of Atlanta, and the most far out portions of Metro Atlanta, and yet those areas, those subdivisions have done the best. So sometimes I wonder, well, does location really matter for the seniors or the active adults? And I don't know if there's a way to respond to that, or just want to
Sure, go ahead.
This is a very important niche market, and when I talk about broad trends, they are broad trends. You're going to always find exceptions to the rule. But there's one thing that really is happening, and that's the active community, over 55 community. My sense is that the baby boomers, when they start moving to these kinds of communities, their demand for these kinds of products will, on its own, change zoning codes. We are so large in number and so powerful at the voting box that we will demand new approaches to meet our different needs than we had in the past. In other words, the baby boomers will drag society into smart growth communities, into mixed use, mixed housing, walkable, transit accessible communities. Hasn't started yet, but my sense is that's where we're going to be ending up.
Well, Chris did say there was problems with zoning, but he also said we'd be 110 burning down our homes. I'm a little scared to go after him, say anything. I kind of take a lot of Chris's remarks and put them into 3 buckets. One, demand, where is demand going, where have we been. The second one is more of opportunity and financing. Do you have a job? If you don't, you're probably doubling up with someone, but if you do have a job, maybe you can get a mortgage and buy. So sort of demand, finance, and then the last one is sort of sites. So I think arguably we do have a lot of changing demand, and I actually live in a community with a lot of folks that are over 55, surprisingly. I'm the young one. And we're on a MARTA bus route, comes right in front of our project. But, so demand is absolutely dynamic and pretty complex right now. But in terms of sites, that's really the part, where in Metro Atlanta do we have available locations for development that's zoned? And then, so we can accommodate those changing preferences and that demand for more urban kinds of communities. And so, just to real briefly just say, ARC and local governments and MARTA have been working a good bit, for 40 years. We actually had transit-oriented plans for every MARTA station back in the early 70s, and we are still doing a lot of that work. And I would say today we have what I call the 12, or roughly a dozen MARTA stations that need a lot of love. They're existing, built facilities. I say, if you wanted to build a MARTA station today, let's just say it costs $100 million, because I have no idea what it costs to build the East Lake MARTA station. But in any event, we've got a dozen MARTA stations that absolutely are ready for more urban development around that station on MARTA property, on adjacent property. So we've got a lot of opportunity just around MARTA stations, but then even places that are inside 285 or even places outside 285. 80% of our jobs are in the 5 core counties: Fulton, DeKalb, Cobb, Clayton, Gwinnett. So absolutely, when you look across those counties, we've got places that are accessible to transit or to jobs that we should be focusing on. And in terms of zoning, absolutely the last decade, or since 1995, I tell people that smart growth was invented roughly in 1995. We've seen lots of good zoning changes. There's planners in the audience. Things that have happened in the city of Atlanta with SPI districts, PCD code in Cobb, Woodstock's form codes. We've seen lots of these kinds of zoning changes, but broadly, when you look at zoning across all those counties, absolutely 70, 80, 90% of the land area is probably the same zoning it was in terms of the actual land area. So we absolutely have a lot of work to do on zoning. But in addition to those dozen MARTA stations, we're going to have a referendum on July 31st, and that referendum will put in place some additional BRT, bus rapid transit. It's a fancy term for creating a bus system that operates like a train. But a BRT, light rail, and other transit services that are going to create even more transit opportunities over the next 20 years. So we absolutely need to leverage those opportunities.
Thank you, Dan. Egbert, let me ask, as a developer of 29 years, Chris mentions schools and education being important, transportation choices, the zoning, and how easy it is to get permits, but people wanting amenities, wanting things, as you say, instant gratification. I want everything where I am. Chris, also, I felt interesting toward the end of your talk, talked about the question about whether we stay where we are and wait for transportation to come to us someday, or whether we need to move to where transportation is going to be. How do you take all that in consideration when you consider development? And there's other developers in the audience. I would welcome comments.
That really is the heart of the question. In other words, what do you put where? Or no one wants to be before the curve unless they're just before the curve. If you get in too early, you're probably going to lose out and you become the pioneer, and that's not a desirable.
We learned from you.
And so I've learned the hard way as well. I would say that the thing that's probably the most, and Dan touched on it, he talked about finance. The reality is the infrastructure costs are too much for any single private development to bear. Most infrastructure investment in rail or the things that are at the fabric of quality of life of communities, schools, etc., those are public investments. And the question is, how do you get public-private partnerships to come together to address all of the ingredients necessary to create healthy and sustainable communities? And there's not a lot of experience doing that. And Georgia is, in some respects, way behind. I don't know where it ranks in states in that regard, but I would have to guess that it's in the bottom 5 or 10%. Because we have not historically had any private collaboration between the infrastructure agencies like the Department of Transportation and so on. As you know, and you saw in the article this morning, or the op-ed piece, we're working on the multimodal passenger terminal. That's the first public-private partnership of its kind. Well, there are a lot of states across the country that have done that hundreds of times. And so you look at places like DC, they have long since learned to leverage some of that public investment. And I will say there's always the missing statement until it gets put on the table and everybody sort of nods and says, yeah, but we don't really want to touch it. There's a reason MARTA stations are not well developed around. It's all about race and class. So you see the numbers up there, and that's true as national trends, regional trends, etc. But developers have to live in the real world, on the ground, with the dynamics that they encounter every day. And Atlanta, metropolitan Atlanta, is built, all of the behavior, 90% of the behavior is built around race and class. So the good news is, when you have high gas prices, transportation challenges, the economy crashes, etc., maybe I'm not so classist or so racist after all. And so we're kind of getting there, and that will change. So that's something I wanted to put on the table. The other thing is on the finance piece. In much the same way that development has mirrored single-use zoning for the last 40 or 50 years, and our zoning codes reflect that, behavioral patterns reflect that. So does financing. So if you go to a financial institution to raise money to do a mixed-use development, they know how to finance multifamily rental, they know how to finance single family, or they know how to finance retail, or office, or hospitality. But if you're talking about a mixed-use development, they're really not that prepared for that. So the banks aren't aligned to support this new change in direction either. So this is a learning process, and all the players are learning on the job, and that's really what's playing out. So we look for places that already have things that we can leverage that make up quality of life. And the schools, I will respond to in a later question because I know I've been talking for quite a while, but that is truly, to me, if not in the top 2, it may be number 3, because it's at the top of the list of things that will dictate how development happens, and certainly which regions across the country will thrive. And we're not in good shape in that regard right now.
Eugene, I see you nodding your head. Is that?
Well, he had his nerve when he talked about schools. That was one of the most perhaps scary comments I heard in terms of, I believe the statement was in 2030 we'll look back at, in the 2000s and say those were the heydays for public education. Yikes. I only hope that you're wrong in that regard. And I have seen, it seems as though I'm experiencing or witnessing perhaps more effort by local school officials today to try to do something to make area schools better. I hope that trend continues. There's certainly no silver bullet to fix the problem. I can only hope and pray that our schools continue in an upward trajectory. I am watching, perhaps because of the downturn, we are seeing more people pull their kids out of private schools right now and placing them into public schools, and I don't think that trend will all of a sudden reverse itself and go the other way. And another new trend, since I make my living by analyzing the new home market, newest trend we're seeing is builders, first of all, we are starting to build a whole lot more houses today, and that's a good thing for the overall economy. But builders are paying far more attention to specific school attendance zones today, perhaps than ever before. And that has a lot to do with the fact that people are watching their pennies and nickels a whole lot more closely and prefer, if at all possible, to send their kids to public schools instead of private schools. So I don't know if anyone, if you want to share additional thoughts or comments about that. Or...
Well, we've got about 30 minutes. I'd like to open it up to see if there's comments on Chris's presentation or questions for anybody on the panel. I think we've got mics in the room, so if you'll introduce yourself, just so we can all get to know each other.
Yes, hello, my name is Jessica Londier. I live in the city of Atlanta, and I work also for the city of Atlanta. And one trend was disinvestment from major retailers in urban areas. And now we see, they feel more comfortable building in the city, that they bring the suburban pattern into the city. And that has been very difficult for us, even with SPI zoning and special zoning. They all want the drive-through and the parking up front, and it seems like there's a bigger lag with national retailers to build in an urban form. They will promote walking and biking, and follow the trend that's shown in a lot of the surveys. I don't know if you have any thoughts on how to turn that around, because like near Lindbergh, somebody wants to build a big box, but we need mixed use there. That's the perfect place to have walkable mixed use, but we're getting a suburban development instead. And it has the SPI zoning. So I don't know if you have any
Anybody?
comments on that.
Chris?
This too will pass. Let the big box happen. The big box is going to serve a market need now. But when the box is there and demographics continues to march along with all the changes, that big box will be gone in 10 to 15 years. It's usually a 15-year lease on the box itself. It'll be vacant probably within 10. For all kinds of smart economic reasons, frankly, it'll be vacant or reused but not held by the original tenant. And then, because it's so inexpensively constructed, it's easy to deconstruct. So it's basically a harbinger of a future opportunity, in my view. Let it happen and begin thinking now about what it is you want to create public-private partnership in 10 years when that building has run its course.
Dan?
I'm going to disagree. Lindbergh obviously is a critical transit center. Important to MARTA. We've invested a lot of money there. We shouldn't allow any more big box around Lindbergh. And I would even argue that if you look across Metro Atlanta and look at where we've seen redevelopment, it hasn't been a lot of the strip centers. Strip centers kind of, go to a lower rent tenant or whatever happens, but a lot of the redevelopment, look at all Assemblers projects on Moreland, the perimeter. There were multifamily that was raised and then put in place mixed-use products. So I just think we haven't seen enough of the strip centers go away, and I don't want to give them another spot.
I don't know that you're in disagreement. I mean, I think Chris is saying, let them go ahead and do it. It won't last very long. We are living in the transition. When you're living in the transition, this is always what happens. You can see what's needed, and it's coming. But the people who are making investment decisions today, they have their model, and all they're doing is running their playbook. And all of these retailers have been building for the last 50 years a certain something. They know how to do that, they know it well, they know all the checklist points along the way to figure out where to locate. And they're trying to force that square peg in the round hole. They will learn in their departments, in their real estate departments, that, oh, you know what we have as our prototypes no longer work. We need new prototypes for the new communities that are evolving. And they will get there. So I don't think it's sort of one or the other. It's both, but they're moving to what Dan described, away from these big boxes. You're just impatient, appropriately so, because you want to walk out to the street and go to a bunch of small boxes as opposed to this one big box. They'll get there too.
And we certainly see that in food preferences. I mean, we were told for years we couldn't build grocery stores unless they were 120,000 square feet in the city. Actually, it's not true. They figured out how to do that. Question here.
Joe Robertson, Fannie Mae. And this is a purely selfish question, as you can imagine. I just want to make sure if I have to move into the big mansion that I'm prepared to do so. But in all seriousness, Dr. Nelson, what do you see? Well, I mean, what's the future? We can kind of infer, and we've heard directly from both sides of the aisle as to their thoughts on the GSEs, but who fills the gap? And I know Mr. Perry is engaged on our board, and we'd love to hear his response. He may not be able to respond, but who fills the gap? What happens? Because financing, as he mentioned, is going to play a part in what goes on in the next 10, 20, 15 years and how housing looks. So I just would love to hear your response to that.
I've been asking a lot of people around the country I know who know more about this than I do, so let me share with you what I think I know. First of all, there's a large number of influential politicians on both sides of the aisle that think that the GSEs have run their course. That the time is right now to think of something else for the next generation or two. What is that? One option I've seen is where you take the powers or the tools of the GSEs and enable private institutions to have those same tools and actually be held to some accountability when they begin to use those tools. But to do that, you have to create incentives, tax or financial incentives, to induce the institutions to do the kinds of things that Fannie and Freddie and others do. The best case scenario I've heard so far has been from some professors at Wharton who say that they think that if the GSEs are history, there'll be some transfer of authorities and powers to federally chartered institutions, but they will only do about half the business of the GSEs. Now, what does that mean for homeownership? That means that we'll take a 2-point hit on the homeownership rate, pushing homeownership rates further down from even my projections. So we could be looking at homeownership rates in the upper 50s, 57, 58% by 2030 if the GSEs become history. Nobody that I've talked to says there's no way that the private institutions will do all of the business of the GSEs. Optimistically, it'll be half.
If I could just say, Bill, the Atlanta Regional Commission Board actually about 3 months ago voted to support Senator Isaacson's bill called the Mortgage Finance Act that basically says, let's take Fannie and I guess Freddie and go through an orderly reorganization, but he still thinks, the core of a 90% loan needs to be something that's available to Americans. And so you can go look at Senator Isaacson's webpage. I'm sure he's got an overview.
I want to make a couple of provocative comments. And this won't surprise many people in here, but most of the people that are debating what should happen to the GSEs are some of the most uninformed people out there. So it is playing out in a political environment, and there are certain realities, and you would never know it from the media coverage or the common language that's being used out there, because the GSEs are easy targets because they're the GSEs. But the fact is that the rate of seriously delinquent loans in the portfolios of the GSEs are a fraction. The rates are a fraction of what they are in the private entities. So the banks have much worse portfolios than Fannie and Freddie. Now, we talk about privatization of the GSEs, and that sounds great. Everybody loves to hear just privatize it. But Fannie and Freddie, if this was a football game, they got into the game at the start of the fourth quarter. So the damage that we have going on was not a damage created by the GSEs. Now they did enable it by getting in the game later on and bought a bunch of stuff that they didn't underwrite and it would never have gone through their underwriting. Now this is fact. And the truth is, it is true that if you get rid of the GSEs, you will have to find some other basis by which to provide what they were providing. And what pains me, and I do sit on the board, I was brought onto the board shortly after it went into conservatorship. I went on December of 2008. And it's painful to watch how the political environment destroys the ability to fix the problem faster rather than slower. So when everyone is out there talking about compensation is out of whack and all of these things should be changed, well, guess what? The private institutions, the public companies, the large banks and so on, they are raiding Fannie and Freddie's people at an alarming rate. Very good people working hard every day to fix an $11 trillion housing finance system. And while everybody is vilifying the employees at Fannie and Freddie, and by the way, the leadership, 90% of that leadership is brand new. They weren't in those leadership positions and caused the problem. They're actually fixing the problem. But you're trying to fix this while the rug is being pulled out. So the political environment is really one of the single biggest problems we have in trying to do things in an orderly, logical, rational way. And so, you're with Fannie, let me tell you, I didn't have a big perspective going in. I have a great amount of appreciation and admiration for people who go to work every day at Fannie and Freddie just to be called everything except child of God. They're called scum of the earth, etc., etc. And if you let the political environment dictate what's happening out there by what they say, you would think that these are just some horrible human beings out there, when in fact, they're doing all of us a tremendous service.
Hey, he's talking about you, Joe.
I'm gonna mention something else that I'm even more worried about than the GSEs going, and that's what's called the Qualified Residential Mortgage Rule, the QRM, or what I would call SQUIRM. Under the rule, I don't think it's been implemented yet. It's still under debate. But one piece of that rule would have, as I understand it, federally chartered banks, as a matter of routine, require a minimum 20% down on home mortgages. Well, you know, we used to do that, 20% down. So I went to the American Housing Survey, and I looked up a table and discovered that 2/3 of all American households that bought a home paid less than 20% down for their homes. 2/3 put less than 20% down on the homes they own. You can get rid of Fannie and Freddie and take a hit on the home ownership rates. But if the QRM goes in, or the SQUIRM goes in, with this rule, we're going to see home ownership rates tumble even further.
And of course, if home ownership rates tumble and home building slows down, that slows down the entire U.S. economy, which means even fewer jobs. So I'm for Freddie and Fannie and the GSEs personally staying in the game, and I think I too believe they do more good than harm for our country.
All right, this is about 15 minutes out. We think the clock starts ticking. Everybody decides they've got a comment. I see this person's already standing up before I called on him. And I see about 5 people with their hands up. So I'd like more succinct questions. And for the panelists, more succinct answers so we can get as much in as we can. Yes, sir.
Yes, thank you. Along the same...
And you are?
Excuse me, I'm Jason Allen. I'm with Overall Construction and also the Georgia Homeownership Alliance. Dr. Nelson, you mentioned the shifting of the home ownership rates and the new prospective homeowners being more minorities and and them being less able to afford homeownership. In terms of the 20% down payment, that's generally a conventional Fannie Freddie or conventional market. What about the FHA? How does FHA, with their current 3% down payment, how does that play into the picture?
It's been around a long time. It's a fairly small, I mean, it's millions, but it's a relatively small aggregate player in the market. I just don't, you still have the underwriting requirements that even FHA adheres to. And I don't see a lot of increase in the ability of the FHA to do more to extend homeownership than it already is doing. My concern is that we as a society have essentially chosen by default not to properly prepare the next generation of students for the future. And most of that next generation are minorities. We are simply not preparing them because we've decided by default not to. As a consequence, they're not going to generate the incomes that they need to afford homes with or without FHA. I'm just looking at the cold hard facts, and they're disturbing. You know, and we'll look back to the 2000s as the heyday of public support for public education. Look around the country, look around the metropolitan area here, and I don't see the public's commitment to put the real money that we need into education to generate the kinds of talent that we need to be globally competitive by 2030, and therefore generate the incomes we need to have the future generation earn for our society's benefit. It's not going to happen. It's unfortunate.
Question right here, then one over here. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Bruce Gunter with Progressive Redevelopment. I want to ask you a slightly tangential question about jobs. Obviously, it's a huge driver of the housing market, and it's not necessarily connected to where this good vision of how we grow in the future plays out. I think in Atlanta, as we realized, you know, the double whammy of the housing market declining, and then we realized we weren't having the job growth, and the jobs we were having were very low. They were low-paying jobs. So there's this great conversation about shifting into industries of the mind, the biotechnology, global health, even logistics center. Can you care to prognosticate about, particularly in Atlanta, about maybe where jobs will grow, and not also just the sector, but also the location? Because if they're growing in the suburbs, you know, how is that going to impact the location of the housing? Thank you.
To be a little honest, I don't track the jobs as much as I would like to, even though one of my fields is economic development. My sense is clearly the big fields around the country in the metropolitan area are in medical care, biomedical, high technology. We're seeing the Atlanta area has actually done very well nationally by national comparisons in these job areas. And they tend to be sort of inside or around the perimeter, so they tend to be closer in. So I think we'll just continue to see those trends. Every so often, the Department of Labor generates its occupational outlook. It does so for the nation, and also you can disaggregate it down to metropolitan areas. I haven't looked at that lately, but I just recommend anybody go online and look for U.S. Department of Labor occupational outlook, and you'll find sort of the next 10-year trends for jobs. But what I do pay attention to are things like wages, aggregate wages, per capita income, everything else. You know, we ended the 2000s with lower per capita income in real terms than we started the 2000s. The people I talk to and the things I read tell me that we'll end this decade probably with flat, if not even lower per capita income in 2020 than 2010. That's going to have an effect on home ownership rates as well. Some people call me Dr. Gloom. Other people call me Dr. Doom.
Well, one thing I was going to say about jobs that I think Eugene can say it better, is that we actually did add jobs last year in Metro Atlanta. You want to say something about that?
Yeah, sure. Over the past 22 months, the Atlanta region actually has gained jobs. Unfortunately, we didn't discover that we were actually actually creating jobs until mid-March, when the Department of Labor went back and revised their figures for 18 months. In my opinion, an awful lot of damage had been done to the Atlanta region since the headlines read for over a year's time that Atlanta was the worst MSA in the U.S. for jobs. And of course, that's changed for the positive, but you're not going to read about anything very positive in the media, since they make their living based off of, making things sound as bad as they possibly can. We've all heard the saying, if it bleeds, it leads. But educating, interestingly, education and health led the job creators throughout the downturn here in Atlanta over the past couple of years. And it does appear that trend will continue with regards to job formations, primarily being in education and health.
Okay, Maria.
Maria Supporta. I'm one of those bad journalists, I guess. My question is, in looking at your chart about household types, and by 2030, only 29% of the households will have children. I wanted to see if you could talk about the value of real estate in relationship to quality public schools. A lot of the growth in the suburbs in Metro Atlanta has been generated by good, great school systems. Are we going to see that linking become less important, or are we still in a situation where that's going to determine market value?
Thanks for coming, Maria. I think that somebody mentioned earlier moving into the right attendance zones for schools. That's always going to be the case. You're always going to see a market preference and market premiums paid for being in the better school attendance zones. Some of the biggest bloodbaths I ever saw living in Atlanta was when a school district would even think about changing school attendance zones. You'd think there'd be another civil war going on, because people do value their attendance zones. Having said that, I had a very interesting conversation with a former student of mine from Georgia Tech. She had married, two students married, and they had children, and they lived in Decatur, fairly close to the MARTA station there, in a bungalow. And I said, well, gee, now you have children, does that mean you're going to move out to the good suburban schools, DeKalb or Gwinnett or whatnot? She says, are you kidding? And her perspective was very interesting. She says, if we moved out there and had great schools, in 20 years, when the kids are gone, we'll want to come back to where we live now and live the next 40 years of our life where we are now. Her perspective was child raising was a 20-year window in a 60-year marriage partnership. So she's looking ahead to say, where do they want to be in 30 years and 40 years? And if that's where they live now, they will do a charter school, or they'll fix schools where they live now to cover the window. Then the kids are gone, and then they still live where they want to live, and that's a bungalow in Decatur. That was such an insight that I use that whenever I can, because this is the thinking of the next generation. Not all of them, but if only a quarter of the next generation thinks this way, that's a sweeping change on choice patterns across metropolitan America.
But Chris, Decatur has very good public schools.
Yeah.
But so how does that make it?
Maybe it's better because she and other people like her have made it better. This is 10 years ago when I talked about this.
It's been good for years.
Okay, well, that was her perspective. She said she didn't want to move to anything better school districts. Yeah.
All right, I'm going to try to get a couple more questions in. The dynamic here is about 10 minutes out. We all got something to say. So I'm going to try to get a couple more. Let's hear, and then we'll come back here.
Good morning. My name is Sharon Kelly. I am the Director of Housing and Community Development with the Atlanta Urban League. Dr. Nelson, you are to be commended on your report this morning. I was particularly impressed, especially with the numbers concerning the national home ownership rate. And in a lot of the conversation that we're hearing right now, we're talking about things that actually totally impact that home ownership rate. One of the things that I'd like to see, and it was mentioned this morning about the organizations, the groups, the lenders coming together and focusing on a way to increase the national homeownership rate. That is also a tool that will help to slow down the foreclosure process, because I think that we can close that gap. The more people that can purchase homes, especially the homes that are being foreclosed. Foreclosure is inevitable for some people because of some economical factors that are beyond their control and the country has not fixed right now. But we can put some things in place to address increasing the national homeownership rate. And one of those would be education. And there are some things that are being worked right now. I would definitely need a copy of your presentation today. It represents where we're headed right now in our strategic plan. I have an event, and this is a plug for the Urban League right now, and all of the housing counseling agencies. There will be a national homeownership event June the 30th. That's going to be the largest homebuyer education workshop ever held in the state of Georgia. We're expecting at least 250 first-time homebuyers to come out. If that happens, that will substantiate what you were saying about people want to purchase homes, people need to purchase homes, whether it's rental, whether it's home ownership. Thank you.
Thank you. Right over here.
Yes, hi, my name is Julianne Gresham Alexandrov. I'm a recent graduate in gerontology from Renau University in Gainesville. My whole outlook has been further opened up today about housing opportunities and what the lifestyle is going to be like for those of us who are aging. One thing that really struck my attention was the fact that by 2015, so many of these aging boomers are going to want to sell their homes. And what I'd like to call attention to, and also adding on to what your comment you just made about the people thinking now about aging 40 years ahead, how about addressing helping people stay in the homes so they're not going to have to sell? There is going to have to be some, of course, movement or the building of new communities to support those who have the means and want to move. But according to the AARP recent surveys, 90% of us who are aging want to stay in our own homes. So that's, to me, thinking, how about bringing community out? I mean, you made the comment about the MARTA, they want the community to come to them, but there's a lot of room for growth in that. And also my friend and neighbor Sandra brought up, what about the medical aspect? There's nothing really said about, none of us as we're aging want to think about, well, we're going to need more medical assistance, if you will. We're going to need not just medical, but other types of assistance. Transportation is one, but just kind of wanted to throw that out there. Aging in place. So.
Point well taken. You want to say something briefly?
Absolutely. That's an interesting and important area. Aging in place. There are two kinds of people who age in place. Those who want to and those who don't want to. Those who want to, by all means, age in place. But many, many millions of Americans will end up not being able to sell their homes, and they will age in place involuntarily. Now, one of the things we need to do to age in place, either voluntarily or involuntarily, is create the opportunities for other people to live in the same home so that person can indeed age in place. And that probably means converting many homes, many millions of homes into, or provide for in those homes, accessory dwelling units. So another family, another couple, another individual can be in the home and help that person, in fact, age in place. The trouble is most zoning codes in the U.S., and most of them in the metropolitan Atlanta area, do not allow accessory dwelling units. So we need to, and AARP is on this issue, we need to address the ADU issue big time and actually make it across the counter permitting, or rather than going through the planning commission process.
Thank you. I know there's a lot of other folks who have comments and questions. I apologize we couldn't get to all of them today.